Hello everyone and welcome to today's bonus lesson of the Butterfly Princess Academy, where curiosity takes flight and wisdom wears wings. Now, on the second of each month, on the second Sunday of each month, you're going to get a bonus lesson here at the Butterfly Princess Academy, and that is going to involve looking at couples or lovers in classical literature, and then the month after we're going to be looking at adaptations of classical literature on film, TV and stage. So this month we're going to be looking at the core elements of Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester's relationship in Charlotte Brontë's classic novel entitled Jane Eyre. So here goes. Core elements of Jane Eyre and Rochester's relationship in Charlotte Brontë's Jane Eyre. Charlotte Brontë's Jane Eyre remains the cornerstone of Victorian literature, not only for its Gothical love, but for its radical exploration of power, mortality and autonomy through the relationship between Jane Eyre and Edward Fairfax Rochester. Their dynamic defines the era's rigid social hierarchies, offering a complex interplay of intellectual piety, moral reckoning and symbolic resonance. So, power dynamics and social class. The tension between Jane's role as a governess and Rochester's aristocratic status frames their relationship. Jane, a penniless orphan, occupies a limitable space in Victorian society, neither servant nor family member. Rochester, by contrast, embodies wealth and practical authority, yet the interactions subvert these hierarchies. Their banter about fairies, as described in chapter 13, and debates on morality reveal an intellectual equality that transcends class. Jane's refusal to be do you think I am automotion, a machine without feelings, chapter 23, challenges Rochester's attempts to dominate her. Rochester's manipulation, such as disguising himself as a fortune teller in chapter 19, underscores his desire to control Jane emotionally. This charade, while playful, reflects his insecurity in facing her unguarded honesty. Their relationship thus becomes a battleground for power, where Jane's moral clarity gradually dismantles Rochester's aristocratic arrogance. Moral and spiritual growth. Jane's journey is defined by her upcoming integrity. When Rochester begs her to stay as his mistress after Bertha's exposure in chapter 27, Jane's refusal, quote, "I care for myself, the more solitary, the more I will respect myself," marks her triumph over passion in favour of self-respect. Rochester, meanwhile, embodies moral ambiguity. His secret marriage to Bertha and attempted bigamy reveal a man shackled by past deceit. The reunion in chapter 37, however, signals redemption. Rochester, humbled by Thornfield's destruction and his physical disabilities, sheds his former hubris. Jane's inheritance, granted her financial independence, equalises their dynamic. Their final reunion, quote, "I am my husband's wife as fully as he is mine," reflects mutual spiritual growth, where Rochester's humility meets Jane's empowered autonomy. gender roles and economy. Jane's defiance of Victorian gender norms is revolutionary. Her declaration, quote, "I am no bird, I am a free human spirit," from chapter 23, rejects Rochester's attempts to master her, such as his insistence she wore finery. Unlike Bertha, who was imprisoned by defying practical control, Jane negotiates equality. Rochester's flawed understanding of love, viewing Jane as a symphony, chapter 27, rather than an equal, gradually evolves. By the novel's end, their marriage transcends Victorian ideals and male dominance, symbolising Brontë's critique of gender depression. Symbolism and Gothic elements. Brontë employs Gothic symbolism to mirror their emotional trials. Bertha Mason, the mad woman in the attic, embodies suppressed female rage and colonial exploitation. Her Jamaican heritage ties Rochester's wealth to imperialism. Her violent outbursts exchange repressed frustrations. The split chestnut tree in chapter 23 foreshadows their separation, while fire, Thornfield's destruction, and Rochester's blindness purges his moral decay. These elements highlight the novel's tensions, blinding psychological depth with Gothic spectacle. So, feminist readings. Gilbert and the mad woman in the attic, positions Bertha as Jane Stark double, reflecting Victorian women's stifled voices. Post-colonial critique. Interrogate Bertha's Caribbean roots, framing her as a victim of Rochester's colonial exploitation. Disability studies analyse Rochester's blindness as a metaphor for moral reckoning, rejecting pure narratives in favour of hostilic transformation. Contemporary debates often frame their relationship as either a toxic romance or feminine parable. Rochester's manipulative tactics, for example, gaslighting Jane about Blanche Ingram, clash with modern ideas of consent, yet Jane's agency rejecting Singing Rivers' proposal, chapter 34, resonates with themes of self-determination. The novel's treatment of disability remains striking. Rochester's injuries do not diminish his humanity, subverting Victorian notions of physical perfection. Jean Rhys's Wild Songresses Sea, published in 1966, reimagines Bertha's story, urging readers to confront colonial and gendered silences in Bronte's text. Jane and Rochester's relationship is a tapestry of conflict and redemption, woven through Bronte's critique of power, gender, and mortality. Their bond, fraught with manipulation and inequality, ultimately transforms into a partnership of mutual respect. A radical vision for its time. By dissecting their dynamic through modern lenses, Jane Eyre continues to challenge readers to grapple with the issue of love, economy, and justice. As Brontë reminds us, true equality is not given but earned, a lesson as urgent today as it was in 1847, which was when the book was published. So now going to look at key scenes in Jane and Rochester's relationship in the novel. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre crafts a turbulent and transformative relationship between Jane Eyre and Edward Rochester, one that defines Victorian class, gender, and mortality. Their bond unfolds through a series of pivotal scenes that reveal psychological complexity, moral reckoning, and symbolic reasons. By dissecting 6 key moments from their charged first encounters to their redemptive reunion. Initial meeting, chapter 12. The novel's first encounter between Jane and Rochester is steeped in gothic drama. Rochester, thrown from his horse, accuses Jane of bewitching it. His bookish son marking vulnerability. Jane, unflinching, retorts, I should have been sorry if I had been the cause of harm to the horse, sir, but I cannot admit that I have been I have been the cause of harm to you. The scene establishes their dynamic. Rochester's traits, brooding demeanour, sharp wit and physical ruggedness contrast with Jane's quiet defiance. Though socially inferior, Jane refuses to cower, foreshadowing her mutual moral fortitude. The collision of the personalities sets the stage for a relationship built on tension and mutual fascination. Rochester's theatrical entrance also mirrors the novel's gothic undertones, hinting at the chaos and secrets that will define their journey. Evening repertoire, chapter 13 to 14. Over nightly conversations, Jane and Rochester debate mortality, religion, and human nature. Jane challenges Rochester's cynicism, declaring, I don't think, sir, you have a right to command me merely because you are older than I, or because you have seen more of the world. Here, Brontë dismantles Victorian hierarchies. Despite Rochester's wealth and gender, Jane asserts her intellectual autonomy, proving herself his equal. Their banter, laced with metaphors like Rochester's fairy analogy, reveals a meeting of minds that transcends class. Their part becomes the foundation of their emotional connection, subverting the era's expectation that women remain passive listeners. Blanche Ingram manipulation, chapter 17 to 18. Rochester stages a flirtation with Blanche Ingram, a wealthy aristocrat, to provoke Jane's jealousy. Jane, forced to witness their courtship, confesses, he is not of their kind, I believe he is of mine. Rochester's manipulation exposes his fear of vulnerability. By feigning interest in Blanche, he tests Jane's affection, hoping to exert a confession of love. Jane's internal conflict, torn between desire and self-respect, accumulates in her resolve to leave Thornfield if necessary. This scene underscores Rochester's emotional immaturity, contrasting sharply with Jane's principled restraint. Proposal under the chestnut tree, chapter 23. Rochester proposes under a chestnut tree, which splits during a storm moments later. Jane's acceptance is tempted by her declaration, I am no bird, I am a free human being with an independent will. The split tree symbolises the fracture in their relationship. Rochester's proposal, though romantic, carries an undercurrent of control. He dresses Jane in finery, attempting to mould her into a conventional bride. Jane's insistence on relenting her autonomy, I will be myself, clashes with his possessive tendencies. The storm's violence mirrors Jane's eternal turmoil, foreshadowing the revelation of Bertha and the couple's eventual separation. Wedding. The wedding is halted by Bertha's exposure as Rochester's living wife. Rochester pleads with Jane to stay as his mistress. You are my symphony, my better self. Jane refuses, declaring, I care for myself, I will respect myself. The scene marks this scene marks Jane's moral triumph. Rochester's self-pity, I was bound to a nature more violent and intolerable than mine, contrasts with Jane's unyielding integrity. Bertha's presence, a symbol of oppression and colonial exploitation, forces both characters to confront Rochester's deceit. Jane's departure affirms her refusal to compromise self-respect and passion, a radical act in society that marginalised unmarried women. Jane's return to Farmfield, chapter 37. Reunited after Farmfield's destruction and Rochester's injuries, Jane vows, I will be your rising hand. Rochester, humbled, admits, I am no better than the old lightning-struck chestnut tree. The reunion embodies mutual redemption. Rochester's physical blindness symbolises moral clarity, while Jane's financial independence erases earlier power imbalances. Their union, now grounded in equality, subverts Victorian marital norms. Jane's role as Rochester's eyes and hands reflects independence, not subversions, completing their transformation from master servants to partners. Power dynamics seem to intellectual equality traces their shift from manipulation. Right, so I won't read that. Jane and Rochester's relationship is a masterclass in layered storytelling, where each scene builds towards Bronte's critique of power, mortality and autonomy. From their electrifying first meeting to their humbled reunion, their journey reflects the tension between social constraints and individual agency. Through firestorm and symbolic rupture, Brontë dismantles Victorian partnerships of equals. These key scenes, steeped in Gothic symbolism and psychological depth, ensure Jane Eyre remains a timeless exploration of human resilience and redemption. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre presents one of literature's most continuous and transformative relationships. That bond between the orphan governess Jane Eyre and her brooding employer Edward Rochester. Their dynamic, fraught with power imbalances, intellectual sparring, and moral reckoning serves as a microcosm of Victorian society's tensions around class, gender, and colonialism. Historical context. The Victorian era enforced rigid social hierarchies where wealth and birth dictated one's status. Jane's role as a governess, a role Brontë herself briefly held, placed her in a precarious social limbo. Though educated, governesses were neither servants nor family members, often enduring isolation and financial dependence. Rochester, as a wealthy landowner, embodies partial authority, yet his attraction to Jane's intellect and moral clarity debilitates their hierarchies. Their relationship defines Victorian norms of courtship, which prioritise wealth and social standing. Rochester's initial attempts to dominate Jane through gifts of finery or manipulative mind games reflect his privileged position. However, Jane's refusal to be objectified, do you think I am a machine without feelings, challenged the Eyre's comfort of women. Bronte's critique dehumanising effects of class and gender roles, positioning Jane's self-respect as revolutionary. Cultural perspectives, feminine and Gothic. Jane's assertion of autonomy, I am no bird, I am a free human being, resonates with early feminist discourse. The 1840s saw growing debates about women's rights, anticipated in the woman question. Jane's rejection of Rochester's proposal and St. Jane's loveless marriage offer underscores Bronte's belief in women's moral and intellectual agency. Critics like Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubber, the mad woman in the attic, interpret Bertha Mason, Rochester's confined cruel wife, as Jane's dark double, symbolising repressed female rage against oppression. Bertha's Jamaican heritage and portrayals across Hyena exposes Victorian anxieties about race and empire. Rochester's marriage to Bertha, forged during Britain's colonial exploitation of the Caribbean, reflects imperialist greed, and other post-colonial scholars such as argue that Bertha's erasure, both literally and metaphorically, highlights the marginalisation of colonial voices. Bronte's subtle critique colonialism by linking Rochester's moral decay to his imperialist past, redeemed only through his humbling and Jane's ethnical influence. The novel's Gothic elements, Farmfield's eerie house, Bertha's madness, and Rochester's traits mirror cultural fears of female sexuality and mental instability. The fire that destroys Farmfield and blinds Rochester symbolises purification, burning away deceit and inequality. Rochester's physical disability, often read through a disability studies lens, becomes a metaphor for moral clarity, rejecting Victorian ideals of bodily perfection. Despite Rochester's social dominance, Jane's intellectual vigour equalises their relationship. Their debates on morality and religion, such as Jane's rebuke, "I don't think so, you have a right to command me," subvert Victorian gender roles. Brontë frames their connection as a meeting of minds, challenging the era's transformation of women's intellect. Jane's refusal to become Rochester's mistress, "I care for myself, I will respect myself," prioritises self-worth over romantic desire, a radical stance in a society that punished women for sexual autonomy. Rochester's moral ambiguity, his deceit and attempted bigamy, contrasts with Jane's unwavering principles, reflecting Bronte's critique of male privilege. The novel's conclusion redefines the relationship. Rochester's injuries and loss of wealth strip him of power, while Jane's inheritance grants her financial independence. Their reunion, "I am my husband's life as fully as he is mine," embodies mutual dependence, transcending Victorian marital hierarchies. Bronte's happy ending is not a surrender to tradition, but a subversion of it, envisioning lovers' partnership of equals. Jane and Rochester's relationship is a lens through which Brontë interrogates Victorian society and justice by intertwining Gothic symbolism, feminist defiance, and colonial critiques. She exposes the corrosive effects of class, gender, and imperialist explorations. Their journey from imbalance to equality serves as a blueprint for personal and social transformation in a world constrained by rigid norms. Brontë persists that true love thrives not by in dominance but in the spiritual respect and moral growth. Jane Eyre remains a timeless testament to the power of individual agency in reshaping oppressive structures. Right. The romance between Jane Eyre, a penniless governess, and Edward Rochester. The governess. The 19th century governess occupied a limitable space in British society. Though educated, she cultivated accomplishments, for example, music and languages in the garters of the upper class. She was neither family nor servant. Governesses faced financial insecurity, social isolation, and the stigma of being a dependent. A woman without a dowry or prospects, as the Quarterly Review noted in 1848, governances were above the servant class but not of the family, a precarious position that made marriage to a man of Rochester's status unthinkable. Rochester's attraction to Jane therefore disrupts Victorian conventions when he declares you stranger, almost unearthly thing, I love you as my own flesh. His words shocked not only Jane but the novel's contemporary readers. A landed gentleman's union with a governess would have been perceived as a breach of social decorum, akin to marrying beneath oneself. Brontë, however, frames their connection as a triumph of moral and intellectual parity over class prejudice. Rochester initially wielded his social power to dominate Jane, testing her resolve through a manipulative game. He disguises himself as a fortune teller to probe her feelings, and flaunts his courtship of Blanche Ingram to incite jealousy. Yet Jane's refusal to be intimidating, I am not talking to you now through the medium of custom, not even of mortal flesh. It is my spirit that addresses your spirit, subverts the master-servant dynamic. Their nightly debates on ethics and human nature further destabilizes Victorian hierarchies. Jane's assertion, I don't think so, you have a right to command me, rejects Rochester's authority, positioning her as his influence of women by showcasing Jane's moral clarity which ultimately humbles Rochester's arrogance. The Victorian angel of the house idea demanded women's purity, obedience, and self-sacrifice. Jane's refusal to become Rochester's mistress after Bertha's revelation, I care for myself the more I will respect myself, defines the pedigree. Her choice prioritises self-respect over social pressure to fall gracefully into ruin, a fate common for governesses seduced by employers. Rochester's attempted bigamy, meanwhile, explores the era's gendered hypocrisy. While Victorian men faced few consequences for external affairs, women like Bertha Mason, whose madness is linked to her cruel heritage and presumed sexual excesses, were confined and erased. Jane's escape from Thornfield rejects the role of victim, affirming Brontë's belief in women's rights to autonomy. Brontë employs Gothic symbolism to underscore the transgressive nature of Jane and Rochester's bonds. The fire that destroys Thornfield Hall, a metaphor for purging Rochester's deceits and colonial sins, embodied by Bertha, clears the way for their moral rebirth. Rochester's injuries, blindness, and a murdered hang strip him of authority, while Jane's inheritance erases her financial independence. Their reunion at 13, a secluded woodland estate, symbolises retreat from a judgmental society. Jane's vows to be Rochester's eyes and hands inverts traditional gendered roles, positioning her as both a caretaker and equal. This partnership, forged in mutual vulnerability, critiques Victorian transcendental nature. Jane and Rochester's relationship is a radical act in a society that marginalised governesses and policed women's autonomy. Bronte's narrative, however, does not merely define norms, it redefines love as a union of equals, where moral integrity transcends class and gender. By granting Jane financial independence and Rochester humility, Brontë dismantles the power structures that made their marriage to be. In a culture that reduced governesses to invisible labour, Jane Eyre insists on their humility, intellect, and right to love. The novel's enduring renaissance lies in its defiance. Love, Brontë argues, is not a privilege of rank, but a testament to the spirit's capacity to raise above convention. Some questions and answers. So, how does Jane and Bronte's relationship challenge Victorian society social norms? Their relationship defines Victorian hierarchies of class, gender, and morality. Class: Jane, a governess, occupies a limitable social position, neither servant nor family. Rochester, a wealthy landowner, represents the aristocracy. Their union transgresses rigid class boundaries as governance were deemed unmarriageable to men of his status. Gender: Jane rejects passive formality by asserting intellectual equality. Her declaration, "I am no bird, I am a free human being," critiques Victorian expectations of female submission. Jane refused to become Rochester's mistress. "I care for myself," prioritises self-respect over social pressure to accept a degrading role. My husband's life is freely as he is mine," reflects the eventful equality subverting the Eyre's marital norms. How does Bertha Mason symbolise the tension in Jane and Rochester's relationship? Bertha Rochester's confined Creole wife embodies repressed female rage, colonial exploitation, and oppression. Feminist critique: Gilbert and Girth, the mad woman in the attic, interprets Bertha as Jane's dark double, representing the fury Victorian women were forced to suppress. Bertha's Jamaican heritage ties Rochester's wealth to imperialism. Her madness reflects colonial offering as Victorian society, non-European identities. Bertha's violence, burning Thornfield, Jane's repressed anger, and Rochester's moral decay. The wedding interruption forces Rochester to confront his deceit of Jane's choosing over passion. How do power dynamics shift between Jane and Rochester? Their power balance evolves from master-servant hierarchy to mutual dependence. Early imbalance: Rochester's manipulation, disguising as a fortune, Jane's economic dependence reflect Victorian gender class norms. Intellectual: Jane's defiance, "I don't think so, you have the right to command me," establishes emotional equality. Thornfield's destruction for Rochester's humility: "I am no better than the old lightning struck chestnut tree," and Jane's inheritance erased earlier discrepancies. The split, right. How does Jane's marriage contrast with Rochester's flaws? Jane's uncompromising ethics highlight Rochester's moral ambiguity. Jane refuses to compromise self-respect, rejecting both Rochester's bigamy, "I will keep the law given by God," and St. Jane's loveless proposal. Rochester conceals Bertha's Bertha manipulates Jane's emotion initially that views her as a savage to be tamed. Her redemption comes only through suffering. His redemption comes only through suffering, violence, and loss of wealth. Laws and principles are not for times when there is no temptation. Underscores her commitment to over convenience. How does Brontë use Gothic elements to critique Victorian? Right. The tremendous relationship in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre 1847 and her sister Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, also published in 1847, have 1847, have captivated readers for generations, offering starkly contrasting visions of love, power, and redemption. While Jane Eyre and Edward Rochester navigate a path toward mutual respect, moral growth, Heathcliff and Catherine Earnshaw's bond spirals into obsession and destruction. Meanwhile, Jean Rees's Wild Togris Sea, published in 1966, reframes Bertha Mason, Rochester's marginalised first wife, through a post-colonial lens, exposing the racial and gender violence silenced in Bronte's classic. Jane and Rochester's relationship revolves through moral reckoning. Jane's refusal to become Rochester's mistress and her departure from Thornfield affirm her integrity. Rochester's subsequent humility, symbolised by his blindness and loss of wealth, allows their union as equals. Their bond, though fraught with class and gender imbalance, accumulates in mutual dependence and spiritual piety. In contrast, Heathcliff and Catherine's love is all-consuming and corrosive. Catherine's declaration, "I am Heathcliff," reveals a fusion of identities that denies individuality. Her choice to marry Edgar Linton for status, "It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff," ignites Heathcliff's vengeance, which devastates 2 generations. Their love, rooted in childhood trauma and social migration, becomes a force of destruction, leaving no room for redemption. Jane and Rochester's challenge Victorian norms. Jane, a governess, upends class boundaries by marrying her employer, while Rochester acknowledgement of her intellectual equality. "You are my symphony," subverts practical dominance. Their relationship critiques behaviours of women, positioning Jane's autonomy as revolutionary. Heathcliff and Catherine, however, are trapped by social Heathcliff's status as an orphan gypsy relegates him to servitude, while Catherine's marriage to Edgar emphasised the era's privileging of wealth over passion. Emily Brontë underscores how rigid class structures corrupt love. Heathcliff extinguishes of Wuthering Heights and Thrush Grange through manipulation mirrors the moral decay bred by exclusion. Jane and Rochester achieve a hard-won equilibrium. Their union symbolises in Bronte's belief in lovers' power to transcend social constraints. Heathcliff and Catherine, however, meet ghostly unrest, their spirits haunting the moors in eternal discourse. Emily Bronte's conclusion rejects reconciliation, instead highlighting love's capacity to permeate cycles of violence when unmourned from ethics. Jane Reese's prequel to Jane Eyre reimagines Bertha Mason, the Antoinette Cosway, not as a mad woman, but as a victim of colonial and exploitation. Set in post-Jamaica, the novel exposes the racial tensions and cultural erasure Antoinette endures as a white Creole woman. Antoinette's hybrid identity caught between European and Caribbean worlds renders her an outsider. Rochester, never named in Reese's text, weaponizes the limited, dragging her as a white and renaming her birth to erase her heritage. Reese links Antoinette's descent into madness to Rochester's colonial entitlement, which mirrors Bertha's exploitation of the Caribbean. The burning of estate Antoinette's childhood home symbolises the destruction of Creole culture under imperialism. Reese subverts Bronte's Gothic tropes to critique gender and radical racial silencing. Antoinette's confinement in Farmfield's attic parallels her marginalisation in a narrative, yet Reese grants her agency. There is always the other side, always. Part 3, Antoinette declares, asserting her story that against Rochester's dismissive account. By centering Antoinette, Reese exposes the colonial subtext claimants in Jane Eyre. Rochester's wealth defined from Jamaican plantation implicates him in slavery's legacy. Reese's portrayal of Antoinette forced displacement and cultural challenging readers to reassess Bronte's betrayal as Bertha as a monstrous other. The Brontes and Reese each use romantic relationships to interrogate systems of power. For Charlotte Brontë, Jane and Rochester's unions envisions love as a bridge across class and gender divides. Emily Brontë portrays love's potential to perpetuate violence when entangled with social exclusion. Reese, writing a central later, unearths the colonial anxiety suppressed by in Jane Eyre, positioning Antoinette's tragedy as a testament to imperialism's human cost. Together, these works form a dialogue on agency and oppression. Jane Eyre's triumph lies in her negotiation of autonomy within constraints. Antoinette's haughty narrative demands accountability for the voices arranged by history. Heathcliff and Catherine, eternally unresolved, remind us that love unearthed from justice breeds only despair. The enduring resonance of Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and Wild Song Gracious Sea lies in their unflinching exploration of love's complexities, where the Brontes dissect the interplay of passion and mortality in Victorian England. Reese forces a reckoning with the colonial past. Through these intertwined narratives, we confront a timeless truth. Love to be transformative must reckon with power in all its forms. Can love truly exist without equality? Rochester's early attempts to dominate Jane through manipulation, gifts, and secrecy raises the question: is love possible when one partner holds social, financial, or psychological power over the other? Is a Rochester redemption earned, or is it a narrative convenience? Does his physical suffering and loss of wealth justify his moral growth, or does Brontë let him off too easily for his deceit and cruelty? Does Jane's return to Rochester betray her feminist ideas? After declaring I am a free human being, does choosing to marry a disabled husband, disabled humble Rochester, reinforce or does it reaffirm marriage as a partnership of equals? What does Metamorphosis erasure reveal about Jane and Rochester's happy ending? Can their union be fully celebrated when it depends on the silences of a marginalised woman? Is their relationship a love story or a critique of power? Does Bronte's... Right. I won't read that. Jane and Rochester's relationship is a mirror held up to the contradictions of its time and ours. It asks us to consider, can love ever be free of the systems that shapes it? Brontë offers no easy answers, but her lucid portrayal invites us to grapple with the interplay of power, mortality and desire, a conversation that continues to resonate in debates about agency, equality and justice. Final thought, conclusion. The relationship between Jane Eyre and Edward Rochester transcends the confines of Victorian romance, emerging as a radical critique of class, gender and colonial oppression. Bronte's narrative challenges the era's rigid hierarchies by centering Jane's moral and intellectual agency, while Rochester's out from domineering aristocrat's humble partner, underscores the transformative potential of equality. Their union forged through fire and reckoning symbolises a quiet revolution, love as a partnership of mutual respect rather than domination. Yet this happy ending is shadowed by the erasure of Bertha Mason, whose voicelessness in Jane Eyre speaks volumes about the marginalised identity silenced by imperialism. Jane Mason and Emily Brontë deepen this critique, exposing how social structures desert love into earlier destructive. Together, these works invite us to interrogate not only the past but also modern narratives of power, agency and justice. Jane and Rochester's relationship remains a lens through which we examine timeless questions about power, autonomy and love. Whether read as a feminist triumph or a colonial analogy or gothic melodrama, Jane Eyre endures because it refuses easy answers, inviting each generation to grapple with its complexities anew. For scholars and enthusiasts alike, the journey into Bronte's world is never truly complete. It evolves with every critical perspective, adaptation and reader's reckoning. A cornerstone of feminist literature criticisms, redefined analysis of 19th century women's literature by interrogating partial constraints in feminine female authorship, drawing its title from Bertha Mason, Rochester's imprisoned wife in Jane Eyre. The book positioned Bertha as Jane's mad woman, embodying the repressed rage and rebellion Victorian women were forced to conceal. Gilbert and Gulliver argue that male-dominated literature traditions force women writers to depict female characters as either angels or monsters. but Bertha Mason improvised the latter, serving as Jane's dark double, who in acts for fury Jane must suppress to survive norms. Women writers faced a lack of legitimate as in female role models, leading to schizophrenia of authorship. This anxiety manifests in texts with hidden feminist subtext beneath sufficiently. For example, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre critiques gender inequality through Jane's quiet defiance, while Mary Shelley's Frankenstein explores female creative struggles via Victor's upset of life-giving power. That won't. Right. Charlotte writes, not only for its brutal heroine, but for it desire. Modern adaptations, however, do more than retell Jane and Rochester's story. They interrogate its silences, redefine it, and confront its complacency in systems of oppression. By analysing how contemporary filmmakers reinterpret Jane and Rochester's relationship. Right, so recent film, which will go in more in this next month, recent films and television adaptations of Jane Eyre, such as the 2011 film and Sandy Welsh's 2006 BBC miniseries, reinterpret Jane and Rochester's relationship through lens of psychological realism, feminist agency, and Gothic unease. These adaptations reflect shifting cultural priorities, framing their bonds as both a romance and a cautionary tale about power. The 2011 film version, Jane Eyre, starring Mia Wasikowska as Jane, as Wiakowski, as Jane, and Michael Fassbender as Rochester, amplifies Jane's quiet defiance. Scenes linger o'er her intimate gaze, emphasising her moral calculus as she navigates Rochester's manipulations. When Jane declares, "I'm no bird and no nest ensnares me," the film stages her rebellion not as a dramatic outburst, but is a quite resolute act of self-preservation. Rochester, meanwhile, is portrayed with unsettling ambiguity. Fassbender's smouldering charisma contrasts with flashes of cruelty, such as his gaslighting of Jane about Blanche Ingram. This duality challenges audience to reconcile Rochester's vulnerability with his toxicity, a tension Bronte's novel only partially resolves. Modern adaptation refuses to romanticise his flaws, instead framing his redemption as contagion on accountability. Gothic atmosphere and trauma. The 2006 BBC adaptation, scripted by Sandy Welsh, uses the Yorkshire moor's bleak beauty to extraordinise Jane's inner turmoil. Rochester Rochester, in this version, he was played by Toby Stephen, portrayal portrayed by actor Toby Stevens' portrayal of a man haunted by guilt, not just over Bertha, but his colonial past, by hinting at Rochester's complexity in Jamaica's plantation economy. The series invites viewers to question his moral standing. These adaptations also foreground Jane's trauma, her childhood abuse, economic and social marginalisation as central to her resilience. Her relationship with Rochester becomes a battleground where survival and self-respect collide with desire. Modern retellings often exercise Brontë's more controversial elements. For example, Jane's final reunion is a reward for Rochester's suffering to emphasise her autonomy. In the 2011 film, Jane's reunion with Rochester is understated, devoured of triumph. His blindness and mirrored hand symbolises not punishment but humility, positioning their partnership as one of equals rather than saviour and saved. Jane releases while Douglas dismantles Jane Eyre's colonial and racial hierarchies by centering Bertha Mason, renamed Antoinette Cosway, the Creole heiress whose erasure enables Jane's happy ending. This novel compels readers to confront the imperious violence underpinning Bertha's narrative. Rees reimagines Antoinette as a tragic figure caught between European and Caribbean identities. Her marriage to Rochester, a nameless Englishman in Rees' text, is not a Gothic plot device but a coalition of cultural exploitation and gendered violence. Rochester's renaming of Antoinette as Bertha anticipates colonial erasure. She is Bertha now, he declares, stripping her of her history. By humanising Bertha, Rees exposes the racism and misogyny Bronte's novel neutralises. Antoinette's descent into madness is not a gate, but a consequence of an imperialist oppression. In Wild Douglas Fire's redemption, in Rees's work, fire symbolises both destruction and defiance. Antoinette's dreams of burning Farfield, "I lit up the room with the flame of my hair," reclaims agency, transforming her from Bronte's monstrous other into an average avenging spirit. The act compels readers to reassess Jane Eyre's conclusion. Jane's triumph is predicted on Antoinette's alienation, raising ethical questions about whose suffering is deemed narratively expandable. Rees's novel treats Jane Eyre as a sacred text, but not as a sacred text, but as a palpably laying silent histories over Bertha's centric framework. By doing so, she challenges readers to interrogate the classic status of centralised works, asking, "Will stories are erased to uphold literal masterpieces?" Modern audiences steeped in discourse of consent, gaslighting and emotional abuse increasingly question whether Rochester's character can be reconciled with contemporary ideas of accountability. Rochester's actions, concealing his marriage, testing Jane's loyalty, and framing her as a fairy or sprite, resonates uncomfortably with modern understandings of coercive control. His attempted bigamy, framed in the novel as a desperate act of love, reads today as a violation of trust. Adaptations like the 2011 film do not shy away from this tension, lingering on Jane's anguish after the aborted wedding. Bronte's narrative links Rochester's redemption to physical suffering, a trip critique critique by disability scholars like David Mitchell and Sharon Signer. Narrative, his blindness and loss of farmfield are framed as moral purification, but modern viewers may ask, does trauma excuse exploitation? Post-Me Too #MeToo adaptations increasingly resist romanticising Rochester's flaw. The 2023 Jane Eyre stage adaptation by Sally Cookson portrays him as a man grappling with his privileges, his final scenes emphasising Jane's choice to return rather than his divergences. Rochester's accountability is intoxicable from his colonial past. Jane Reese's work implicates him in the violence of empire from the threat of Antoinette's dowry for her Creole heritage. Modern audiences attuned to intellectual critiques demand that adaptations acknowledge the legacy rather than reduce it to a romantic subplot. Conclusion. Modern adaptations and post-colonial revisions prove that Jane Eyre is not a relic but a living text. Its meanings reshaped by each generation's values. By reimagining Jane Eyre and Rochester's relationship, these work challenges us to confront the novel's complexity in colonialism and while celebrating its radical cause, Jane's insistence on selfhood. While Sogrissi compels us to read against the canon, amplifying voices erased from imperialist narratives. Meanwhile, contemporary debates about Rochester's accountability reflect a broader cultural shift towards centering victims' perspectives over romanticised authorities. Ultimately, these reinterpretations do not diminish Bronte's legacy, but enrich it, ensuring Jane Eyre remains a site of dialogue, a story that continues to ask, what does it mean to live freely in an unfree world? And I want to tell you now about reimagining and adaptation. Rachel Hawkins, The Wife Upstairs, 2021, transcends Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre into a sun-drenched, morally murky world of suburban Alabama, transforming the gothic romance into a razor-sharp thriller that interrogates modern anxieties about class identity and the mask we wear to survive. By reimagining Jane as a cunning Rochester as a charismatic but sinister tech mogul and the mad woman in the attic as a vanished influencer with secrets of her own, Hawkins crafts a story that is much a critique of contemporary as it is a homage to Bronte's timeless themes. Plot. Hawkins' novel follows Jane, a broke and enigmatic dog walker in Birmingham, Alabama, who intensifies the gated community of Farmfield Estates. There she meets Eddie Rochester, a wealthy widow whose wife Bertha and her best friend died in a mysterious boating accident. Jane seizes the opportunity to reinvent herself, seducing Eddie while navigating the whispered rumours about Bee's disappearance. The plot thickens as Jane discovers that Bee, glamorous, ambitious and ruthless, might not be dead after all, her shadow looming over Farmfield like a ghost. Right, we don't need to read that. Hawkins, right. We don't need to read that. The Wife Upstairs succeeds not just as a thriller but as a cultural critique using Brontë's framework to dissect 21st century obsessions, cultural identities, the call of feminine and the illusion of melancholy by reimagining Jane as a grifter, B as a vengeful entrepreneur, and Rochester as a wolf inventor, capitalist clothing. Hawking strips away the romanticism of Jane Eyre to ask, in a world where everyone is performing, who holds the power? The novel's answer is decisively modern, paralysed with those who see through the performance and are willing to burn it down. In this, Hawkins honours Bronte's radical spirit while crafting a story that could only exist now. A thriller for the age of Instagram, #MeToo, and the unravelling of the American dream. By situating the life upstairs with these intellectual dialogues, we appreciate its role in the evolving legacy of Jane Eyre, a testament to the enduring relevance of Bronte's exploration of power, identity, and the shadows that lurking behind society's facade. And that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, concludes this month's bonus lesson at the Butterfly Princess Academy, where curiosity takes flight and wisdom wears wings. I would like now to take this opportunity to thank you all for joining me for this month's bonus lesson, and I very much hope that you will be able to join me again in the very near future for more lessons at the Butterfly Princess Academy. But until then, take care, and I will see you all again very soon. Bye-bye for now.